While individual donors are the bread and butter for most nonprofit agencies, providing that critical financial support that they need to keep the lights on and to fulfill their mission, there are other funding sources as well. So in this lesson, we'll talk about other revenue streams that nonprofits can explore. Because nonprofits must rely on financial support in order to afford to work toward their mission, donors are obviously a very important stakeholder group. Financial support for nonprofits, however, doesn't just come from individual donors, but there are other donors and contributors who support the mission as well through financial funding. And these funding sources can come through grants, corporate giving, and other funding. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand the role that grants and grant funding plays in nonprofit organizations. You'll also understand that nonprofit corporate partnership and how that serves as an important funding source. You'll also be able to distinguish between various employee giving programs and how supporters can sometimes contribute their services on an in-kind or pro bono basis as a means of non-financial support. And you'll also have a better grasp on other nonprofit funding sources. Many nonprofits rely heavily on grant funding. Some nonprofits are funded almost entirely by grants, and these are financial awards that are provided to nonprofit agencies by various entities. It can be government agencies, private or public foundations, or other grant-making institutions. When you hear the term grant maker or grant making as an adjective, this just refers to those entities who provide and fund those grants. Grants are different than a donation in a few ways. They're similar because neither grants nor donations are repayable, so it's not a loan or a debt that you owe, but there are some distinctions between grants and outright donations. Grants are designed and generally intended to support a specific project or a general operation of a nonprofit. Some nonprofits will even design new programs or services around a grant opportunity. So if I run a food pantry, I see that there's a large grant opportunity for agencies that provide clothes to beneficiaries in need. I might decide to expand my services to include providing clothing to my beneficiaries. And I do that and design that program specifically in an effort to try to receive that grant to then fund that expansion. And then other times, nonprofits already have existing programs or services that fit and align with the specifications of a grant. Now, just like we have our donor cultivation process, when we are soliciting donations, we have to kind of follow a process when it goes to getting grants in nonprofits as well. And it is similar and aligned in many ways to that donor cultivation cycle. First, we need to identify opportunities. Going out and finding grant opportunities can be a job in and of itself. There are some websites that will house different grant opportunities that serve as a central hub for nonprofit employees or volunteers to go and search and see if there are any grants that maybe align with their mission. After you identify those opportunities, sometimes you cultivate relationships. Many times, grants will require online application, which requires a grant proposal. But if you have an opportunity to get in front of decision makers or build relationships with people that are behind the purse strings of those grants, and cultivating those relationships, that can improve your chances of receiving the grant. Then you develop your grant proposal. You explain how your agency's mission fits with that grant. And in particular, a certain program, service, or initiative that you're going to do aligns with the specifications of that grant. You have to build a compelling case of that in what's called a grant proposal. So this is a formal application that includes not just what you're going to use that grant money for, but it also specifies things like project goals, budgets, timelines, and your expected outcomes. And you have to explain how those outcomes align with the specifications of that grant. So as you can see, grants, they're a lot more complicated usually than direct donations. When you're making a direct donation, you have to sell the cause and make the case for financial support. But in a grant process, this is a much more formalized process where you're having to give written estimations of goals, budgets, timelines, and things like that. Then, if you're fortunate enough to receive the grant, you have to manage and administer that award. You have to execute the program, service, or initiative that you said that you're going to use that grant money for. Some grants require sort of progress reports. So you have to go back to the grant maker and update them on your progress. And that starts to feed into progress reporting, where you're updating on the progress. You're demonstrating, yes, we administered this grant based on what you gave it to us for. And then you provide ongoing stewardship. So that grant maker feels good about you and your agency and knows that you're using their grant money for the right things and that you're being successful in achieving the outcomes that you said you were going to achieve. Next, let's talk about grant funding sources. So who are these grant makers and where do these grants come from? If you look at all grant makers, you can broadly categorize them as government, foundation, corporate, or individual grants. Grants are, by design, intended for a specific project or initiative. But some grants sometimes will be for unrestricted purposes. So it's like unrestricted gifts that we often get from donors. We're allowed to use that money for whatever purpose, obviously, as long as it aligns with our mission. So grants that are unrestricted give nonprofit leaders the flexibility to allocate the funds where it's most needed in that particular agency. Government grants are financial awards provided by the government, and these can be federal, state, or even local agencies, and they're intended to support programs that serve the public interest. So drilling down a little bit more into government grants, let's examine some distinctions between federal, state, and local grants. Federal grants are awarded by federal agencies. This can be things like the National Institute of Health, the NIH, which might fund things like American Heart Association initiatives for heart health, or American Cancer Society, which serves the public interest of people with cancer. The Environmental Protection Agency, they may fund grants specifically for environmental causes, like clean water initiatives, like clean air and anti-pollution initiatives, and agencies associated with environmental protection. So these federal grants, they're usually around specific functions that serve the public interest, and that can be healthcare, education, environmental conservation and protection, and social services. State and local grants are awarded by state and local governments, and they're usually intended to address regional or local needs and grassroots priorities. So smaller grassroots agencies, or those that have more of a strong local presence, as opposed to maybe one of those large national affiliate organizations, many times they rely on state and local grants because they're doing the type of work that aligns with the grant maker's requirements. Now, the government isn't the only grant maker. We also have foundations. Foundations can provide support through direct donations, but they often can serve as grant makers. And instead of making an outright donation, sometimes they will make grants instead. Private foundations offer grants to nonprofits that align with that foundation's stated areas of interest. Probably one of the most well-known is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So instead of just directly contributing the money, they issue grants around specific initiatives. Community foundations are those regional or local organizations that provide funding in the form of grant funds to nonprofits within a specific geographic region that addresses those grassroots local community needs and that improves the quality of life in that region. Sometimes corporations want to issue grants rather than corporate sponsorships or corporate contributions. And this is where they'll establish their own foundation to manage charitable giving, and they'll issue grants through that foundation. Individual grants are those provided by usually high net worth individuals and philanthropists who choose to direct their personal giving through grants rather than donations because they want it to go to a more direct and specified cause. And then there are international NGOs, which is a non-governmental organization. These are grant makers that fund grants for nonprofits that focus on global issues. Some of the most well-known are Oxfam, Save the Children, and the United Nations. They issue grants to nonprofits all over the world, but these are for agencies that are addressing global issues, not statewide issues, not United States specific issues, not local grassroots issues, but global issues that affect the world population. United Nations is not only an NGO, it's also considered a multilateral agency. This refers to member states that provide grant funds to nonprofits for projects that align with their global development goals. The most well-known are the UN, but also the World Bank and regional development banks. So multilateral means they work at different levels, but they're looking at these global issues from that broad perspective. And then additionally, they're often niche grant makers focusing on a really specific area of interest. For example, you might have an organization that makes grants specifically for Catholic-based organizations or other faith-based organizations or other very specific, very niche purposes. Now, if you get into nonprofit work and you work for a nonprofit agency that relies heavily on grants, don't be discouraged if you face a lot of rejection because most grant applications will not yield success. Nationally, the statistics are pretty grim. Grant writing success ranges from about 10 to 30% if you look at the nonprofit industry nationwide in the United States. So you've got to put a lot of shots on goal in order to secure a grant. Now, sometimes nonprofits don't like this lack of success. They also don't like the fact that a lot of times grants have a lot of administrative work associated with them. So they won't go chasing smaller grants. But some nonprofit agencies have no choice but to rely on grant funding. And for larger agencies that receive huge funding, for example, from national health agencies, they're very dependent on maybe one grant funder. For example, the nonprofit that I led for over 10 years, we didn't rely on local grants at all because we were a large affiliate national organization. But our national headquarters office received over half of our multi-million dollar annual funding through a grant through the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health. So that's a massive amount of money. We were very, very dependent on that grant from just that one source, that government agency. As we've discussed, corporations will sometimes make direct donations if they've established a foundation, or sometimes they will issue grants through their corporate foundation. But there are other ways that nonprofits can partner with corporations and for-profit enterprise to fund their work. If you look at corporate giving, collectively it totals approximately $450 billion each year in the United States. So there's a lot of money here potentially for nonprofits. So nonprofits will often solicit corporations for funding. Again, it can be a direct donation, it can be a grant through their corporate foundation, or there are other things as well that we'll discuss. Corporate social responsibility, or CSR, refers to a company's commitment to conducting its business ethically and in a socially responsible manner. So a lot of companies will do CSR initiatives, and that might be things like ensuring that they're paying a fair wage, taking steps to ensure that they're minimizing their pollution and their environmental impact. And another part of many companies' CSR initiatives is providing financial support to nonprofit agencies. So that nonprofit corporate partnership can be mutually beneficial. The company benefits by partnering with a nonprofit to show that they are socially responsible. Consumers feel better supporting corporations that they know care about society and care about the world beyond just trying to make a profit. And nonprofits benefit, of course, because they're getting the necessary financial resources to work toward achieving their mission. Corporate support can come in the form of direct corporate donations, which support nonprofit operations. So this is just an outright contribution through their foundation. But sometimes corporate support can come in an indirect form, and this can be through sponsorship of things like events, employee giving programs, pro bono work, and cause marketing. But regardless of if the support is direct or indirect, many nonprofits rely heavily on these corporate partnerships to fund their work. Now, if you go into nonprofit work, you're going to be doing a lot of networking. You're going to be interacting with folks in the community. You're going to be networking to identify potential donors. You're going to be networking to find corporate sponsors. So when it comes to corporate support, we have to solicit that support, just like we do with donations. Now, with corporate giving, it's a little bit different. With a donor, we're going to sell them on the mission. We're going to sell them on the cause. We're going to make them feel good. We're going to elicit an emotional response, especially if that donor has a personal connection to our cause. When it comes to corporate giving, however, a lot of corporate decision makers may not necessarily have a connection to your cause. So you have to network, you have to make yourself known among the corporate decision makers. And then when it comes time to make your pitch to ask for that corporate support, you need to present a value proposition. You need to explain to that corporation and that decision maker representing that corporation, here are the benefits that your company will receive in exchange for supporting my nonprofit agency. So more so with donations, with the corporate support, we have to answer the question, well, what's in it for me? Now, it would be great if every corporation truly believed in CSR and they were socially responsible and they just supported nonprofits because it was the right thing to do. But being for-profit agencies, they're focused primarily on making a profit. So a lot of for-profit companies need to be sold on the value of donating to nonprofits, and in particular, donating to your nonprofit. So if you're a nonprofit leader, you've done the work. You've networked, all the corporate decision makers in your community know you, they like you, you've presented a value proposition explaining why that company should support your cause and the mission, what they're going to get out of it. Once you then get that corporate support, you have to decide how to leverage that corporate sponsorship model as a revenue source while simultaneously balancing various risks. Now, what I mean by corporate sponsorship model is where we establish various giving levels that come with various benefits that we then present as that value proposition to our current and prospective corporate supporters. It might look something like this. If you run an animal shelter and you host the annual Fur Ball, it's a black tie fundraiser for your mission, you might go to potential corporate sponsors and present to them various sponsorship level opportunities. They can donate as low as $2,500, and that will get them tickets to the event, recognition at the event, and some minimal things like that. Or they can pay $5,000 to be a corporate sponsor, still supporting the mission, to be a gold sponsor. That gets them an entire table where they can fill that with people from their company, and that gets them 10 seats at that table. They might also get an ad in the event program, really showcasing to people, look how philanthropic this company is. They support our cause. And then they might have a highest level, like a platinum sponsorship level. That might get them 2 tables, a full program ad, other VIP perks, and they get other benefits in exchange for their sponsorship. One thing that's really important to understand here is that corporate sponsorships are not donations. They are different. Not only is it different in terms of how we get that support, corporate sponsorships are not always completely or even partially tax deductible. So the IRS says if someone makes a contribution to a nonprofit cause, they're not supposed to get anything out of it. And as a result of that, because they're giving so generously, they get to deduct that amount on their taxes, generally speaking. But with a corporate sponsorship, as you can see here, with these hypothetical furball sponsorship levels, the corporate sponsor, they're getting things out of it. They're getting bottles of wine. They're getting admission to an event where they're going to be served dinner and they probably have an open bar. They're getting actual gifts. They're getting things that are of value. And the IRS says you can't take that as a tax write-off. So if a company sponsors my furball at $10,000, when I send them a thank you letter, an acknowledgement letter, which I'm required to do, I must deduct out of that the fair market value of all of the benefits that sponsor received in exchange for that $10,000 corporate sponsorship. So if I add up the value of all the things they get, I may determine that it's $2,000 in value. Therefore, the company can only write off $8,000, not the full $10,000, because they received benefits in exchange for that sponsorship. So if you work in nonprofits and you engage in that corporate sponsorship model where you are selling sponsorships in exchange for corporate funding and they're getting benefits out of it in return, you absolutely need to ensure that you're in compliance with IRS regulations. Now, that corporate sponsorship model, it doesn't just apply to our fundraising events, but we can also establish things like this for programs and services. So as a board member of Cancer Support Community, I might go to my local hospital system and say, hey, we want to host a monthly support group session to help families impacted by cancer, but this costs money. Would you be willing to sponsor this and cover the costs entirely for our staff to run it, to rent out a facility, to provide food, to publicize the event to people who might want to attend, and all of the other costs that we incur by executing a program like this? We put a dollar amount on it, we go to that sponsor, we pitch that to them, giving them that value proposition, and they may very well say, yes, I will sponsor this event for $10,000, covering all the costs and hopefully then some, and that additional money can then go directly to your mission. They get the huge benefit of that publicity of now I'm saying our cancer support care monthly support group is sponsored by St. Elizabeth Healthcare. So they're getting a lot of recognition. A health system is directly tied to obviously people impacted by cancer. They want people impacted by cancer to come to their health system. So they get a lot out of it and the nonprofit benefits by having the funding they need to execute a program they might otherwise not have the funding for. Now, of course, corporate funding can present a very lucrative revenue source. In my many years in nonprofit work, I have been lucky enough to have some corporate sponsors that would support my agency to the tune of over $100,000 a year. That would take me a lot of effort to go out and try to get that as individual gifts, even 10 major gifts at $10,000. So I was always appreciative of the high value of a lot of corporate sponsorships. But it's important for nonprofit leaders not to just chase the money and get blinded by the dollar signs. They need to be conscientious when it comes to ensuring that the nonprofit corporate partnership is one that makes sense. We previously discussed the concept of tainted money and tainted donors. And the same kind of thing applies here. And in particular, certain nonprofits, depending on their mission, have to be extra careful not to accept corporate funding from companies that are in conflict with their mission. For example, if I'm CEO of the American Lung Association and Philip Morris, a major tobacco company, comes to me and says, we want to sponsor your nonprofit agency and we'll give you $5 million a year. You better bet I'm going to turn that down. And yeah, turning down $5 million sounds crazy for someone running a nonprofit. But Philip Morris producing tobacco products and vaping products is in complete contradiction with my mission, which is to support healthy lungs. And that's a pretty obvious situation where someone would turn down a corporate sponsorship. But there are a lot of other examples where agreeing to a sponsorship can come back to bite that nonprofit And it's not always so obvious. So before you accept a corporate sponsorship in the nonprofit sector, you really have to look at that corporation and make sure it aligns with your mission. Another way corporations indirectly support nonprofits is through the establishment of employee giving programs. And this is part of that nonprofit corporate relationship. So employee giving programs, this basically refers to employees of a company supporting a nonprofit. So instead of a company itself sponsoring a nonprofit event, making a donation, or issuing grants to a nonprofit through its foundation, they rally their employees around a specific cause or mission. One way they do this is through workplace giving campaigns. So these are formalized, organized charitable giving programs where the employees can donate a portion of their salary, and it's usually taken directly out with payroll deduction, and that goes directly to the nonprofit organization of either their choice or that the company has decided to rally around. So this can be nice because it's voluntary and it encourages employees to support charitable causes, and employees may or may not receive some tax benefit depending on their individual tax situation. But you'll often find corporations that rally around a certain cause because that makes them look philanthropic. And then they can brag and say, last year, our company and its employees supported such and such nonprofit agency to the tune of $10 million. But the upside for the company is they didn't even necessarily donate all that money. Their employees did. Now, a component of employee giving programs that is generally part of it, but not always, is a matching gift program. This is where the employer says, okay, we're going to rally around donating to nonprofits in general, or we're going to rally around one specific cause that we've identified that's important and aligns with our corporate values. And to motivate and incentivize their employees to make a contribution, the company will say, we will match you dollar for dollar. So if an employee donates $100, the company will match that $100. Some companies will even do a 2-for-1 match. So if an employee donates $100, the company will then match that at a 2-for-1 rate. The company will contribute $200, meaning that contributions impact has effectively been tripled. So matching gift programs are a really great way for companies to encourage employee giving, but to also put their money where their mouth is and match that support. Sometimes you will have an employee who works for a for-profit company who is really passionate about a nonprofit cause. Usually it's something that they're directly impacted by, and they will take the initiative to drive a fundraising campaign. So they'll go to company leadership, for example, and say, I have a child that's impacted by diabetes. I'm very passionate about the American Diabetes Association. I'm participating in their 10K walk fundraiser this summer. Can I try to recruit support from my coworkers? And would the company also be willing to support? So sometimes corporate fundraising is driven this way, where it's one or a few employees who are really pushing for that initiative. And somewhat related to that, another type of corporate indirect support, and this is not financial in nature, are employee volunteer programs. This is a sort of an in-kind contribution where companies are donating labor. They will allow their employees on the clock while the company is paying that employee to go volunteer for a nonprofit agency during work hours, or they give them paid time off to take a day to volunteer for a nonprofit. Just like employee volunteer initiatives as a form of indirect non-financial support, there are other ways that for-profit companies can provide indirect non-financial support to nonprofits, which is through pro bono work and cause marketing. Pro bono is a term that you've probably heard most frequently on shows like Law and Order or related to the legal sector. It's a Latin term that means for public good. So if you're a pro bono attorney, you're providing your legal services to people in need without charging them any rate or fee. So a lot of times in the nonprofit sector, we need expert professional services that are generally very expensive. This actually might be legal services, but also marketing support, advanced public relations support, graphic design, IT support. If you run Doctors Without Borders, you need doctors to provide their support and their skills. So a lot of companies that focus on these services will offer these services for free without billing them if it's a nonprofit agency. Now, for-profit companies are in it for a profit, so they don't run around giving out their services for free to every single nonprofit, but often they will identify certain agencies that align with their corporate values, and they'll provide their services at no cost. So they'll bill their traditional clients, but they'll provide those same services for free for their nonprofit partners on a pro bono basis. So when I led a nonprofit as executive director, I was very fortunate to have a lot of really talented professionals on my board and that supported my cause. So anytime I needed legal advice or I had a trademark issue that came up once, I was able to go to these professionals and get their high value professional advice and services but they didn't bill me. And that was of huge value. So even though it wasn't a direct financial contribution, I otherwise would have had to go out and hire a professional and pay a lot of money for those professional services. Another form of CSR is cause marketing. This is where a for-profit company enacts a promotional campaign for the purpose of selling their products, but also tying it in to some type of nonprofit or social cause or benefiting a nonprofit organization. So the for-profit company benefits, they look good in the community, they benefit from that reputational boost that comes with very publicly supporting a good cause. And here are some examples of other cause marketing strategies, often aligned with a company's CSR or corporate social responsibility initiatives. One is a donation campaign, and this is where companies commit to donating a portion of their sales or profits or a fixed amount from every product or every service sold to a designated nonprofit or cause. So for example, if I'm the CEO of Kellogg Company, I might work with the American Heart Association. So in the month of February, which is Heart Health Awareness Month, $1 from the sale of every box of my Heart Healthy cereal goes directly to the American Heart Association. So it's great for the company because they get that reputational boost of being seen as someone who cares about the world and cares about society. And the American Heart Association benefits because even though it's $1 a box, Kellogg's, they sell a lot of cereal. So that $1 a box could potentially be millions of dollars. Another type of donation campaign is a give one, get one strategy, where you donate one of something in exchange for every sale of that thing. Probably the best known example of this strategy is Tom's Shoes, where if you buy a pair of Tom's shoes, they will donate a pair of shoes to someone in need. So it makes their customers feel good and knowing I'm going to buy shoes anyway. Why not buy Tom's shoes and know that I'm effectively helping someone else in the process? An awareness campaign happens when companies use their formidable marketing platform, channels, and budget to help raise awareness rather than funds for a particular nonprofit or cause. Usually they'll do this around month campaigns like American Heart Association's Heart Health Month in February. So maybe they're not directly contributing any money. Maybe they're not doing a donation campaign, but they're using the month of February to build awareness about heart health and to build awareness for the American Heart Association. And finally, a point of sale campaign. This is where companies solicit donations for a nonprofit from customers. So there's many times you've probably been checking out in a retail store or going through the drive-through of a fast food restaurant. And when you go to enter your credit card, they give you the punch pin or you buy it on the app. You're asked at McDonald's, for example, would you like to round up your purchase with that roundup amount going to the Ronald McDonald House? So these are called point of sale campaigns, where for-profit companies are directly soliciting a donation from their customers at that point of sale. Now, the hard truth is a lot of for-profit companies engage in CSR activities out of a marketing interest. Consumers now more and more are expecting companies to behave ethically, and part of that is being socially responsible. So a lot of times companies will engage in CSR or implement CSR programs kind of from a marketing purpose. But there are some companies that really do take this very seriously. They really care about social impact. They care about minimizing their environmental impact. They really do believe all the things that we say is important in corporate social responsibility. And they engage in those behaviors consistently. Companies that do that can receive what's called a B Corp certification. Now, this gets a little confusing because this has nothing to do with a legal business form, like an S corporation or a C corporation. This is strictly a marketing term that a nonprofit agency came up with. And this nonprofit agency is called B Lab. B Lab is an organization that exists to push corporations to be socially responsible. And their mission is to redefine success in business by not just a profit, but promoting and fostering a global movement of companies that prioritize CSR. So they have a lot of requirements, a checklist, and if a company can demonstrate we're doing all of these things that you say are important, then B Lab will then designate that company as a certified B corporation or a B Corp. So if you go to purchase a product and you see that B corporation logo on it, that means you can feel good as a consumer because you're spending your money buying a product from a company that has truly demonstrated that they care about CSR. So much so that they've met the rigid and high standards set forth by B Lab. But B Corp has nothing to do with business form, has nothing to do with legal form or IRS. It's simply a marketing term, a way to certify for-profit companies that truly embrace the tenets of CSR. And this is something that is run by B Lab, which is a nonprofit organization that holds corporations accountable. Now, previously, we've talked at length about donations. We've now talked about grants, and we talked about corporate support. But there are additional revenue streams when it comes to nonprofit funding. Here are some other common nonprofit funding sources. Now, none of these represents the biggest chunk of the pie. As we previously discussed, the pieces of the nonprofit funding pie come primarily through donations, corporate support, and then grants. But that doesn't mean that these funding sources aren't important as well. We previously discussed how donors will sometimes establish an endowment instead of making a direct outright financial gift. And as a refresher, an endowment is where a donor puts their money toward the nonprofit, but it's invested in the stock market. And the nonprofit is only able to spend off of the revenue that's generated from interest and dividends. They're not allowed to touch that principal. So nonprofits that have large endowments receive a sizable amount of interest and dividends. So endowment revenue can be a big source of funding for some nonprofits. A lot of educational institutions have established endowments, and this is a huge funding source. There are some universities that have multi-million or even billion-dollar endowments where the interest that's generated off of that represents a huge portion of their annual revenue. We talked at length about selling the cause and how selling the cause involves bringing money in through events, programs, and tangible products. So that, of course, is an additional funding source. Some nonprofits actually sell goods and services. They don't just provide free products, and they get earned income from that. Other nonprofits offer fee-for-service contracts. So they might offer specialized services. So it's an intangible product, it's a service, and they charge fees for those services. Sometimes nonprofits own intellectual property, so they can earn licensing or royalties off of that when other people use those intellectual property assets. And impact investing. This is a kind of a newer thing. This is where some nonprofits are establishing investment funds and acting sort of as a venture capital approach. And this requires buy-in from donors and a donor's willingness to direct their money into an investment fund versus a direct outright traditional contribution. So this can get really complicated, and it is a newer thing in the nonprofit sector, but it's all about using money, investing that wisely, and then making a social impact with that. So as you can see, nonprofit fundraising, it's not just about soliciting individual gifts. There are a lot of potential revenue sources for nonprofit agencies to tap into. This, however, requires a coordinated effort and overarching fundraising strategy, and every nonprofit leader should make it a goal to establish a formalized strategy to ensure that they're not missing out on any of these funding opportunities.